There are moments in life when something inside you starts to stir. It's not fear, it's not sadness, it's a feeling hard to explain, as if a silent part of your being were trying to awaken. Perhaps you've felt it on nights where silence weighs heavier than usual, in moments when you look at your life and feel there's something more, something you haven't yet understood. And now I want to ask you something. What if this moment, this precise moment you're hearing these words, wasn't a coincidence? And what if coming here wasn't an accident, but a response to a deep calling that was born within you a long time ago? Because the knowledge we're going to discuss today doesn't appear to just anyone. It doesn't reveal itself out of curiosity or for entertainment. It reveals itself only to those ready to change the way they perceive reality. For centuries, this knowledge was protected, sealed, kept in silence, like a sacred fire that couldn't fall into distracted hand. Not because it was dangerous, but because its true power can only be understood by those who are willing to transform themselves from within. Today, you're about to discover principles that have been called invisible laws, silent rules that govern everything that exists, even what seems chaotic. And the most surprising thing is that these laws are already at work in your life, even if you've never heard of them before. But there's something you need to know. By the end of this journey, you'll understand how to apply these laws in your life, consciously, clearly, deeply, not as theory, but as real transformation. Now, before we continue, take an internal pause. Breathe deeply, even in silence, and listen to what your inner self wants to tell you. If you feel these words arrived at the right time, if you feel something within you recognizes this calling, write in the comments, "I am ready to receive the truth." And if this message starts to touch something deep within your soul, if you feel this energy awakening you, you can support this space with a super chat as a conscious gesture, so that this wisdom continues to expand to those who are also ready. Because what you're about to hear is not just knowledge, it's memory. An ancient memory that lives within you long before modern books existed, before science tried to measure the invisible with its instruments and formulas, even before the world's great religions took the form we know today. There was a type of knowledge that didn't circulate freely, wasn't taught in public squares, wasn't debated in the markets, wasn't available to just anyone who was simply curious. This knowledge lived in specific places, in built spaces, with a very precise intention, in temples that weren't for worship, but for initiation. And at the center of that entire tradition, always pronounced with respect, always with reverence, there was a name that the initiates whispered, like someone holding something sacred in their hands. Brothers, Hermes, Trismegistus, thrice great, thrice wise, thrice initiated into the deepest mysteries of existence. Some traditions described him as a human being who reached such a high level of understanding that his name became synonymous with wisdom itself. Others described him as an entity that existed between the world divine and the human world, like a bridge between the visible and the invisible, like a messenger who brought from higher dimensions the knowledge humanity needed to not get completely lost in the darkness of its own oblivion. What all accounts have in common is this: His knowledge didn't come from books or human teachers. It came from the direct, profound, and sustained observation of the laws governing existence at all its levels. Hermes didn't study reality from the outside, like someone observing an object. He studied it from within, as if entering into communion with what they observe, until the distinction between observer and observed disappears. And what they found in that state of communion was something so precise, so elegant, so absolutely coherent, it couldn't be a product of human imagination. It was the language of the universe. It was the code that sustains all that exists. In the lands of ancient Egypt, surrounded by desert and silence, and a night sky so full of stars that it was impossible to look at it without feeling something nameless, there existed centers of learning that official history has only just begun to recognize. They weren't places open to the public. They weren't spaces for collective devotion or visible rituals that any traveler could witness. They were spaces of radical transformation, spaces where those who entered as one person left as something different, not different in appearance, different in understanding, different in the way they perceived reality. Those who entered these centers went through processes we would today call initiations, but which in that context were more like a symbolic death, followed by a rebirth. They were led to confront their deepest fears, their most ingrained illusions, their most deeply held beliefs, and in the process of watching all that crumble, they discovered something no book could have taught them, that behind the personality, behind the personal story, behind fear and attachment, there was something that remained intact, something that couldn't be destroyed because it had never been born in the same way as the body. That something was pure consciousness, and recognizing it not as a concept, but as a direct experience, was the true purpose of all Hermetic teaching. For centuries, this knowledge survived in the only way that something truly valuable can survive. From heart to heart, from awakened mind to prepared mind, from master to disciple in a chain that traversed empires, conquests, destructions, and rebirths. When the great libraries were burned, temples were plundered, and entire bodies of knowledge disappeared among the ashes of history, this tradition found a way to persist because it didn't depend on paper. It depended on human beings who had incorporated it so deeply that it had become part of themselves. And then, at a moment some describe as providential, a part of that knowledge took written form. A brief, seemingly simple text, signed by authors who chose to remain anonymous and identified themselves only as the three initiates. That text was called the Kybalion, and its appearance in the modern world was no editorial accident. It was, according to many esoteric traditions, a deliberate decision to transmit it at the precise moment humanity would be sufficiently prepared to receive it. The Kybalion is not a book to be read. It's a book to be lived. Every time someone approaches it with the right disposition, with the openness of someone genuinely willing to question what they think they know about reality, something happens within that person, not dramatically, not with visions or spectacular revelations, but silently and deeply, like a root finding water in the darkness of the earth and beginning to grow unseen from the outside. And perhaps that explains why these words are reaching you now, not by algorithms or statistical chance, but because there's something in you that was already ready to remember what these words are about to awaken. If you feel something within you recognizes this story, even if you can't explain it in words, write ancient wisdom in the comments. And if you feel this story is awakening something deep within you, you can support this energy with a super chat as a conscious act to keep this knowledge alive among those who feel the call. There's something few people dare to say out loud, but almost everyone has felt at some point in their life, sometimes in the most unexpected moments, in the middle of a celebration that should make them happy, or on an ordinary afternoon with no particular event to justify it. It's a feeling of emptiness that doesn't respond to logic, a restlessness that doesn't disappear with entertainment, constant occupation, or accumulated achievements. A kind of inner hunger that isn't satisfied by anything the outside world offers as a solution. And the most common reaction to that feeling is to try to ignore it, to fill oneself with activity, to seek more stimuli, more distractions, more noise, because the silence where that feeling resides is too uncomfortable for most. But there are people who, at some point, stop running. They pause. They allow themselves to feel that restlessness without trying to suppress it immediately. And in that moment of honesty with themselves, they begin to ask questions they had never allowed themselves to formulate before. Questions like, why? Despite having everything I'm supposed to need to be happy, something is still missing. Or, why do I keep repeating the same patterns in my relationships, in my work, and how I react to the same types of situations? Or, why doesn't the effort I put into certain areas of my life produce the results I would expect according to any reasonable logic? These questions are not signs of weakness or ingratitude or some disorder that needs to be medicated. They are signs of clarity. They are the soul asking questions that the conditioned mind doesn't know how to answer because it was trained to look for answers in the wrong place. The root of our era's spiritual problem is not evil or ignorance in the ordinary sense of the term. It's something more subtle and profound. It's the disconnection. A disconnection that began generations ago and has deepened with each new layer of technology, speed, constant stimulation, and ideologies that reduce human beings to their economic and biological dimensions, completely ignoring the most essential dimension of their nature. Hermeticism calls this living outside the law, not in a moral sense, but in a cosmic sense. When a human being lives without understanding the laws that govern reality, when they act from reactivity instead of from consciousness, when they make decisions out of fear instead of from understanding, they inevitably experience constant resistance, a feeling that life creates friction at every turn, that effort doesn't yield what it should, that cycles repeat without anything truly changing. And that resistance isn't a sign that life is unfair, it's a sign that you're swimming against the current of natural laws that sustain existence. Imagine someone trying to grow a plant without knowing anything about the conditions that plant needs to thrive. They plant it in the wrong season, over water or underwater. They put it in a place where it doesn't get enough light. And then, when the plant doesn't bloom, they conclude they don't have a talent for gardening, that they don't deserve plants, that the universe doesn't want them to be a gardener. But the problem was never the universe. The problem was ignorance of the laws governing that plant's growth with human life. The same exact thing happens. When you don't understand the laws governing the manifestation of reality, when you don't understand how your internal state determines what you perceive and attract externally, when you don't recognize the natural cycles of expansion and contraction that operate in all dimensions of existence, you end up fighting against forces you can't overcome because they're bigger than you, not because they're enemies, but because they are the fundamental laws of reality. Nobody wins a battle against the laws of physics. What you can do, what Hermetic traditions have taught for millennia, is to learn to understand those laws, to work with them instead of against them, to become someone who consciously navigates the currents of existence instead of someone who is swept away by them without knowing why. And that process of understanding, that step from cosmic ignorance to operative consciousness, is what in the Hermetic tradition is called the path of the initiate. It's not a path reserved for a chosen few. It's a path available to any human being who decides to take the first step. That first step isn't dramatic. It doesn't require giving up anything external or adopting any particular lifestyle. The first step is simply this: to recognize there are laws you don't know, and that these laws are operating in your life at this very moment, with or without your knowledge, with or without your consent. If these words describe something you've felt, if you've ever wondered why your life seems to move in repeated cycles, write in the comments, "I acknowledge my disconnection to heal." And if this message is putting words to something you've been feeling for a while, you can support this teaching with a super chat as a conscious exchange, a way to keep this energy of understanding alive. At some point last century, physicists working in the world's most advanced laboratories began to encounter something they couldn't explain within the conceptual framework they had inherited from Newton and Descartes. They found that at the subatomic level, the behavior of matter's smallest particles did not obey the mechanical laws that describe the behavior of large objects. They found that a particle could behave as a wave or as a particle depending on whether it was observed or not. They found that two particles that had been in contact could remain instantaneously correlated, regardless of the distance separating them, in a form of connection that defies all ordinary understanding of space and time. And they found something that proved deeply disturbing to the classical scientific mind, that the observer isn't neutral, that the very act of observing a particle modifies its behavior, that the observer's consciousness is a variable that cannot be eliminated from the experiment. The most insightful scientists, those with the intellectual honesty to follow the implications of their own discoveries wherever they led, began to articulate something that sounded more like mystical philosophy than hard physics. That consciousness isn't an accidental product of the brain. That consciousness could be the prerequisite that makes the existence of material reality possible as we experience it. That, at some fundamental level, mind and matter aren't two separate things, but two expressions of the same principle. Hermetic masters would have immediately recognized this conclusion, found it familiar, found it obvious, because that's precisely what the first principle of the Kabbalion, the principle of mentalism has been asserting for millennia. The all is mind, the universe is mental. This phrase, which at first glance might sound like a poetic or metaphorical statement, is actually a technical declaration about the fundamental nature of reality. It doesn't say that the physical world doesn't exist. It says that the physical world isn't what it appears to be. It says that matter, space, time, circumstances, events, relationships, everything we experience as objective and external reality has its origin in something that isn't physical. It has its origin in consciousness. And if the origin of your reality is consciousness, then working at the level of consciousness is not a spiritual luxury or a form of escapism. It's the most fundamental, most direct, and most powerful intervention there is to transform any aspect of your life experience. This is where many people encounter the first obstacle, because there's a huge difference between intellectually understanding that reality begins in the mind and vividly experiencing that understanding in a way that genuinely changes how you perceive your daily life. Intellectual knowledge says, yes, I understand that my thoughts influence my reality. Vivid understanding means that the moment you feel fear or resentment or hopelessness, something in you recognizes that state not as an inevitable reaction to circumstances, but as a frequency you're generating, and which the universe, following its own laws, inevitably amplifies and reflects back into your experience. This is the difference between reading about swimming and knowing how to swim. And the only way to bridge that gap is through sustained practice, through the conscious application of these principles in the most ordinary moments of daily life, in moments of irritation, impatience, fear, doubt. In those moments, when the automatic tendency is to react from a conditioned pattern, the initiate does something. They stop, observe, recognize the internal state that's being generated, and from that observation, consciously choose a different frequency. They don't repress the emotion. They don't pretend to feel something they don't, but rather elevate their consciousness to a higher level, to the place of the observer, and from that place, they have access to a freedom that the automatic reactor never knows. This is the secret that the principle of mentalism holds behind its seemingly simple words. It's not that you can think your way to happiness with mechanically repeated affirmations without any real internal change. It's that when you genuinely transform the quality of your consciousness, when you change the frequency from which you perceive and navigate reality, your experience of that reality inevitably changes, not like magic or law, but with the same inevitability that a sunflower seed produces sunflowers and not roses. The law is impersonal. It favors no one. It punishes no one. It simply operates with absolute coherence that makes no exceptions. And that coherence, once understood, ceases to be threatening and becomes the most solid foundation upon which any human being can build a conscious life. If you feel this truth awaken something within you, if you start to see your life from a new perspective, write in the comments, "My mind is my creative power." And if this revelation is opening a new way to understand your reality, you can support this knowledge with a super chat as a conscious act to keep this teaching alive among those who seek to awaken when the Hermetic initiates described the universe. They didn't describe it with the language of passive astonishment of someone contemplating something incomprehensible. They described it with the language of someone who has learned to read a system, with the precision of someone who has discovered that behind the apparent chaos of existence there is a structure, a grammar, an order that can be understood and with which one can learn to work consciously. That order was condensed into 7 fundamental principles, not 7 philosophical opinions, not 7 poetic metaphors, but 7 functional descriptions of how reality operates on all its levels, from the most subatomic to the most cosmic, from the most material to the most spiritual. The first principle is mentalism, and we have already begun to explore its depth. The all is mind. The universe is mental. But there is a dimension of this principle that deserves to be pointed out with special clarity. It doesn't say that your personal mind creates reality from nothing in an arbitrary and capricious way. It says that there is a universal mind, an intelligence that sustains and generates all existence, and that your individual mind is a localized expression of that universal mind. Like a wave is a localized expression of the ocean without ceasing to be the ocean. This means that when you access deeper levels of your own mind, when you go beyond the noise of superficial thoughts and accumulated conditioning, you get closer to that universal intelligence. And from that approach, life begins to flow in a way that on the surface seems miraculous. But from a Hermetic understanding, it's perfectly logical. The second principle is correspondence. As above, so below, as within, so without. It means you have much more power over your life experience than you've generally been taught to believe. The third principle is vibration. Nothing rests. Everything moves. Everything vibrates. Everything pulsates. Modern physics confirms this with astonishing precision. At the subatomic level, what appears to be solid, inert matter is actually energy in constant motion, particles vibrating at specific frequencies that determine the properties of the objects they form. But vibration isn't limited to the physical level. Your thoughts vibrate, your emotions vibrate, the words you speak vibrate, the quality of your attention vibrates, and according to this principle, similar vibrations attract each other with the same inevitability that magnets. This explains something most people have observed in their lives without being able to articulate it, that there are people who consistently seem to attract certain types of situations and relationships, while others consistently attract completely different types. It's not luck, it's vibrational resonance. The fourth principle is polarity. Everything has 2 poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Heat and cold are the same phenomenon at different degrees. Whoever understands this also doesn't get too attached to peak moments, because they know that no wave remains at its highest point forever. The wise learn to ride the rhythm instead of fighting against it. The sixth principle is causality. Every effect has its cause. Every event has its precedent. There is no such thing as chance in the sense of something happening without cause. What we call chance is simply the name we give to causes we haven't been able to identify yet. This principle completely eliminates the victim mentality. because it establishes clearly that everything you experience is the result of causes that were sown, consciously or unconsciously, by you or by those who preceded you. And if you are the result of previous causes, you are also the cause of future effects, which means that at this moment, with every thought you choose, with every emotion you hold, with every action you take, you are sowing causes whose effects will manifest in your future experience. The seventh principle is gender. Everything has its masculine principle and its feminine principle, not in the biological sense, but in the energetic sense. The masculine principle is the active force, the will, direction, impulse. The feminine principle is the receptive force, intuition, gestation, nourishment. In the human mind, the masculine principle is the objective mind, the conscious mind that analyzes and decides. The feminine principle is the subjective mind, the unconscious mind that receives impressions and turns them into material realities. When these two principles work in harmony, when the conscious will imprints the correct seeds with the correct frequency onto the subjective mind, the process of reality creation works with astonishing efficiency. When they are in conflict, when the conscious mind desires one thing, while the unconscious mind is saturated with contradictory beliefs, manifestation becomes erratic, inconsistent, frustrating. These seven principles are not independent of each other. They are aspects of the same reality seen from seven different angles. And when you start to see them in action in your own life, when you begin to recognize the rhythm in your emotional states, the correspondence in your relationships, the vibration in the quality of your attention, the causality in your repetitive patterns, something fundamentally changes. Life stops being a chaotic and unfair mystery. It becomes a system that can be understood, worked with, and eventually mastered. If you feel these laws resonate within you as if you've heard them before, write in the comments, "I accept the laws of the universe." And if this knowledge is starting to bring order to something within your mind, you can support this teaching with a super chat as a conscious, energetic gesture to keep this broadcast alive for those who also seek to understand a pattern that repeats with surprising regularity in the lives of almost all human beings, regardless of their culture, education, economic level, or intelligence. A pattern that generates an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering, yet goes completely unnoticed because it's so deeply integrated into how society teaches us to relate to life that it has become invisible. That pattern is the constant war against what is, the permanent resistance to the natural movement of existence, the unconscious but absolutely widespread belief that things should be different from how they are, that life should follow more predictable, more comfortable, more controllable course, and that when it doesn't, something is fundamentally wrong. When the Hermetic initiate observes this pattern from the perspective of the fifth principle, the principle of rhythm, what he sees is humanity that has confused the nature of existence with an anomaly that needs to be corrected because rhythm is impersonal. It doesn't care if you're ready for the contraction phase. It doesn't wait for your permission to to move the tide inward, it doesn't stop because you've decided this isn't a good time. To go through a period of darkness or pause or apparent regression, rhythm simply moves. And when you resist that movement, when you try to force things to remain in the expansion phase, when the rhythm is calling for contraction, the inevitable result is suffering. Not because the universe wants you to suffer, but because you're using your vital energy to fight against a force infinitely greater than yourself. It's exactly as inefficient as trying to stop the tide with your bare hands. The energy spent on that resistance is energy that cannot be used to intelligently navigate the cycle, and there's something even more subtle and more devastating about this mistake. Resistance to rhythm not only generates suffering in difficult times, it also contaminates the good times, because someone who lives in constant resistance cannot fully enjoy periods of expansion because they're too busy fearing they'll end. They're too focused on clinging to what they have, on ensuring it doesn't leave, on building walls around their current well-being to protect it from the next phase of contraction that will inevitably arrive. And that anticipatory anxiety turns moments of grace into additional sources of tension instead of sources of recovery and genuine joy. The Hermetic tradition teaches something that goes completely against the instinct conditioned by the ordinary mind, that the psychic and spiritual health of a human being is not measured for its ability to always stay on top, but for its ability to consciously flow through all states of the cycle, for its ability to be completely present in the expansion without attachment, for its ability to go through contraction without identifying with it as a permanent condemnation, for its ability to recognize in each phase of the rhythm, including the darkest and most painful, the seed of what is about to emerge. There's an image that Zen masters use to describe this state of conscious fluidity with the cycles of existence. The image of the moon reflected in the water. When the wind stirs the surface of the lake, the moon's image fragments, distorts, seems to disappear. But the moon hasn't changed. The lake is still a lake. Only the surface has been stirred temporarily. And when the wind calms, the image returns intact. The human being who has understood the principle of rhythm is like that lake. It can be stirred by the winds of circumstances. It can go through storms that temporarily distort the image of peace, clarity it carries within, but in its depth, at that deeper level that the stirring of the surface cannot reach, there is something that remains, something that knows the storm will pass, something that doesn't confuse temporary agitation with permanent reality. Cultivating access to that depth is the most practical and most urgent spiritual work any human being can undertake. Not because it guarantees a life without difficulties, but because it fundamentally transforms your relationship with difficulties when they arise. And when that relationship changes, when you stop spending your vital energy resisting what already is and start using it to consciously navigate what's coming. Something in the texture of your daily experience changes in a way that's hard to describe, but immediately recognizable to those who felt it. If you're starting to understand that your cycles aren't failures but natural processes, write in the comments, "I flow with the cycles of life," and if this understanding is bringing calm to your inner self, you can support this space with a super chat, a conscious gesture, so that this message continues to reach those who still believe they are failing. Growing, when, In reality, they are growing. What you're about to do is not an exercise in relaxation. It's not a stress management technique. It's something that the Hermetic initiates of antiquity understood with a clarity that modern psychology is only just beginning to articulate in its own language. That human beings have the capacity to consciously imprint new instructions at the deepest level of their mind, and that these instructions, when they are held with enough coherence and clarity, inevitably generate new causes that produce new effects in experienced reality. This is the foundation of what the Hermetic traditions call the art of mental transmutation. And the practice you're about to learn now doesn't require any external elements. It doesn't require candles or crystals or specific postures or any ceremonial setting. It only requires your genuine presence and your willingness to bring your attention inward with a clear intention. The first step is to stop the automatic movement of the ordinary mind, not to suppress it, not to force it to stop, but to create an internal space of deliberate pause. Imagine you are the director of a movie that your whole life has been filming itself. Without a director, the camera reactively following the actors. Right now, you decide to take control of the camera. You decide where the attention goes. You decide what to frame and what to leave out of the frame. That's all you need at first. Just that decision to be the director, instead of being swept away by the automatic flow. The second step, non-judgmental observation. Once you've taken the observer's position, start to notice the contents of your mind without trying to change them. Observe the thoughts circulating, the fragments of past conversations, worries about the future, judgments about yourself or others. Don't evaluate them as good or bad. Don't try to modify them yet. Just look at them with the same equanimous distance you'd watch clouds passing by the sky from a train window. This dispassionate observation is in itself an act of great power, because the moment you can observe a thought without being swept away by it, you've established distance between you and the thought that didn't exist before, and that distance is the space where real freedom begins. The third step introduces what in Hermetic language is called the seed mental. The mental seed is a specific state of consciousness you wish to cultivate, not an image of an external result you want to achieve, not a visualization of possessions or circumstances, but an inner quality, clarity, peace, confidence, openness, equanimity, love. Choose just one, the one you feel is most necessary right now, the furthest, the one you long for most. Then, instead of visualizing it as something you don't have, start to feel it as something you're awakening, like an ember that was covered in ash, waiting to be fanned by your attention. The fourth step is sustained resonance. For a few minutes, focusing your attention on that inner quality with the greatest continuity you can. It doesn't matter if your mind gets distracted. Each time you notice you've drifted, simply return without criticizing yourself, because each return is in itself an exercise for the muscle of conscious attention. Like any muscle, it gets stronger with each repetition. While you hold that quality, you can add a phrase to anchor it, not an empty affirmation you repeat mechanically while deep down you don't believe in it, but a statement that describes what you're experiencing right now, even if it's to a minimal degree. Something like my attention creates my experience, or this state I feel now is real and powerful, or I am more than my circumstances. Feel each word as if it resonates from the center of your chest outwards, like the ripples a stone makes when it falls into still water. The fifth step is conscious closure. Before leaving this inner space, take a moment to acknowledge what you've just done, not with grandiosity, just with honesty. You've just exercised your ability to direct your mind consciously. You've just sown a new cause. And that cause, according to the sixth Hermetic principle, will inevitably produce an effect. The magnitude of that effect will depend on the consistency with which you repeat this practice, on the depth with which you manage to settle into the chosen state, and on the time you allow the sown causes to develop into visible results. But the process has begun, and processes that start from the understanding of the laws never fully stop. If, while listening to this ritual, you felt calm or clarity or a sense of connection, write in the comments.
I activate my transformation now. And if you feel that this moment has been significant, if something inside you moved
intensely, you can support this experience with a super chat as an energetic gesture, a way to honor the process you're experiencing. There's a question that sooner or later arises in the mind of everyone who encounters these teachings for the first time, and it's a question, a completely legitimate question. If these laws exist, if they are as precise and as powerful and as universal as the Hermetic tradition claims, why don't most people know about them? Why aren't they taught in schools? Why aren't they part of the basic cultural knowledge passed down from generation to generation as naturally as mathematics or language? The answer the Kabbalion gives to this question is disarmingly simple, because knowledge that transforms requires transformation to be received. It cannot simply be deposited into an unprepared mind, like information is deposited into an empty vessel, because an unprepared mind, a mind saturated with conditioning, with fears, with unshakable certainties about how reality works, cannot truly receive this knowledge even if it hears it. It hears it, but filters it through its existing categories and turns it into something it already knows, into something that doesn't challenge it, into something that can be accommodated without discomfort and therefore without real transformation. This is what in the Buddhist tradition is called the problem of the full cup. If you fill a cup completely and then you try to add more tea, the new tea doesn't go in. It spills. To receive something new, the cup must make space. And making space in the mind means something very specific. It means being willing to question what you think you know. It means being willing to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. No, it means being willing to let go of your most cherished certainties, those upon which the identity you've built and your way of relating to the world are examined with honesty. That requires a quality that is extraordinarily scarce and extraordinarily valuable: intellectual and spiritual courage. The courage to say, perhaps what I believed about the nature of reality was incomplete. Perhaps what they taught me about who I am and what I can expect from life was a very impoverished version of the truth. Perhaps there are dimensions of existence, I haven't yet explored that could change everything. Whoever develops that courage begins to live differently, not spectacularly different right away, but gradually, cumulatively, in a direction that becomes unmistakable over time. Their reactions begin to change. Events that used to drive them crazy for days begin to affect them for hours. Those that affected them for hours begin to affect them for minutes. And there comes a moment that no one can predict exactly, because it's different for each person. When a stability begins to emerge at their core, that surface turbulences can no longer fully reach, not because they've become indifferent, not because they've learned to suppress their emotions, but because they've developed access to a level of themselves that is deeper than emotions, deeper than thoughts, deeper than circumstances. The conscious initiate is not someone who never doubts, never suffers, or never makes mistakes. It's someone who has learned to relate to doubt, to suffering, and to error in a fundamentally different way. One who has learned to see in every doubt an invitation to go deeper in every suffering, a sign that something in their alignment needs to be adjusted. In every mistake, a source of information about the causes they've been unconsciously sowing. This way of relating to experience turns absolutely everything, including the most painful and the most difficult, into working material, into raw material for the great work that Hermetic traditions call the transmutation of lead into gold. Gold, not literal lead and gold, but the lead of an unworked, reactive, frightened consciousness, fragmented, transformed into the gold of a consciousness that knows itself, that operates from its deepest nature, that acts in the world with the clarity and effectiveness of one who understands the laws governing the game they are playing. That is the power of the initiate. Not power over others, not power to dominate circumstances, but the only power that lasts. The only power time cannot erode. The power to know yourself deeply enough to act from that depth rather than from the reactive surface. And that power is available to any human being who decides to seek it with the seriousness got tomorrow.
Not when circumstances are more favorable. Right now, exactly where you are, with what you have, who you are right now.
Because the laws don't wait for perfect conditions. The laws operate right now with the same perfection they always have. If you feel you're ready to walk this path, if you feel something within you has awakened today, write in the comments, "I am ready to awaken." And if this message has touched something deep inside you, if you feel this teaching deserves to keep expanding, you can support this community with a super chat as a conscious way to keep this space alive for soul-seeking clarity. Now, you know something many people go their whole lives without understanding, that reality isn't an accident, that your mind isn't a passive observer, that your life isn't a random sequence of events. It's a process, a constant movement between cause and effect, between thought and manifestation. Every thought you choose, every emotion you hold, every action you repeat becomes part of the fabric of your reality. That means even in difficult times, you still have power. The power to observe, the power to choose, the power to transform. And when many people awaken together, something extraordinary happens. A conscious community is created, a network of people who no longer live from fear, but from understanding. If you feel this message resonated with you and you want to keep exploring this knowledge, subscribe to this space, not as an automatic gesture, but as a conscious decision to walk alongside other souls who are also awakening, because this channel isn't just content. It's a meeting point for those who feel there's something more waiting to be discovered. And if you wish to support this space, if you feel gratitude for this knowledge, you can also do so through a super chat as a gentle, conscious gesture aligned with the desire to expand this community. Now take this phrase and carry it with you. Reality begins in the mind. Transform with consciousness. That's the mark. That's the reminder. That's the beginning of your own awakening.